Dan,
Okay.
hello, beautiful summer day.
Yeah.
I didn't. Oh, fuck, I always do this right before we start recording. I didn't check. Does my microphone sound fine? It sounds like I'm
I
recording
think
through
yeah,
my microphone.
I think it's definitely recording to you.
It's all fine. Dan, two election results in the world this past week are harbingers of the imminent rise of communism, I believe. And we're about to talk about them because we figured we don't really ever talk about current events on the show, but we're reading something this week that we've always joked about reading, and we're finally reading it, and we actually kind of enjoyed it, which was kind of funny. But it does play into a little bit about specific current events that have happened this week, so I feel like we should probably talk about them. Do you want to talk about the UK election first, or should we talk about the French election first? Both interesting.
Let's do the UK. Let's do the UK. Both very interesting. Let's just go in chronological order.
Okay,
I think
chronological order.
Yeah.
The UK election, for people who don't know, obviously massive Labour landslide in terms of the number of seats. Labour's won 412 seats, which is fucking crazy. The Tories have lost, I think, like 250, something like that, which is so funny. And the main thing I think we need to all take away from this, the Greens won 4 seats, which is a historic high for them, which, pinch them on the cheeks. Well done. Good for you guys. And Reform won a couple of seats as well. This is the interesting thing that I think I wanted to mention in this election, because obviously, if you're a socialist and you've been following this election, you know that despite Labour winning all of these seats, they got 500,000 votes fewer than in 2019 under Corbyn, and about 3 million votes fewer, if my math's right, 3 million votes fewer than under Corbyn in 2017. So everybody's trying to act like this is some, holy shit, Keir Starmer, a change of leadership, it finally did it. And it's like, well, okay, maybe let's be materialist about this for a second and understand why this could have happened. But the interesting thing here is that despite this big landslide, Reform, if you took total vote share of Reform and the Tories and you just said, what if everybody that voted Reform voted for the Tories would have won again, which is crazy, which is absolutely crazy. And I don't know in terms of like what this represents. Is this more of what we've seen in recent years of the conservative parties around the world eating themselves alive? I'm kind of tempted to say that, and not being able to coordinate with each other. Don't know what it represents, but it is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that figure that in a vast majority, in a large number of constituencies, if you combine the Tory vote and the Reform vote, they have more votes than Labour. It's basically just the right has been split. In 2019, I think partly due to the particular character and appeal of Boris Johnson, but also the overwhelming weight that the sort of ongoing Brexit negotiations / debacle, depending on what your position is, the weight that played in that election allowed the Conservatives to sort of consolidate a huge number of votes. Reform, or the Brexit Party as it was in 2019, didn't stand in any seats where Conservatives were defending a seat, I think is what happened. Or maybe they didn't or they used some other calculus to determine how they could best aid the Conservative Party in winning, basically. Obviously, that coalition has fractured massively. One of the, I guess, criticisms or miscalculations that people have accused Rishi Sunak of making when it comes to selecting when to have this election was that he picked a time where, or he rather miscalculated, perhaps anyway, whether Nigel Farage was going to enter the race, join or campaign for Reform, which he did. Obviously, he may have been a Reform member already, but in the course of the election campaign, Nigel Farage became the leader of Reform UK and then took the decision to stand. I can't remember which seat, somewhere in Essex, I think, Clacton. And I think that sort of like was one of the sort of like terminal decisions that led to this splitting, at least in the of all the causes, one of the more recent and proximate ones was that. But it's interesting that you mentioned the Greens as well, because obviously so much has been said about what you said about like uh, Keir Starmer's Labour Party coming away with a majority of over 200 and getting 400 odd whatever seats, and based on a relatively small percentage of the votes cast, 34 or something, and also based on a very small number of votes in absolute terms, a lot of which was caused by just a very low turnout, second lowest turnout ever, I think. I think just 2001 was lower. So it's a very shallow victory, although he has this massive majority. But I think that the conditions are laid for that majority to be absolutely destroyed the next election around. Obviously, you point out that Reform came second in so many seats, overtaking the Conservative Party. And there are these conditions whereby if one or other of those parties can recollect all of the right-leaning voters to them, then they could win back a lot of seats. And you mentioned the Greens; they got 4 seats, but they, I think, they came second in about 40 other constituencies, most of them to Labour. So, like, Labour now stands in the position where if they maintain their current sort of like centrist stance, they stand to lose lots of seats in urban areas to the Greens. They stand to lose lots of seats in the north to Reform, and it sort of just depends how many seats they're then going to perhaps lose to a rebuilt Conservative Party or the Liberal Democrats across like sort of home counties England, I guess. I mean, that's the really interesting thing about what Labour have managed to do this time, is actually like win in all these places where they never would have won before, across the south.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, not a resounding victory, and one which it's going to be very difficult for them to hold on to.
And I mean, the interesting thing is too, is like, this is really difficult to do, especially for modern politics, like contemporary politics, I mean. But when you just start thinking about the actual material, like, not the majority voting base of all of these different parties, but the actual like interests that they represent, I should say. It's really interesting to start thinking about this, because Farage is somebody that I haven't really figured out. I mean, like, this kind of rise of authoritarianism and of, populist far right politics around the world has mainly been driven by debt in a lot of places, right? And it's been driven by immigration, at least ideologically, and a lot of different things like this. But Farage is like a city trader, and I don't really understand like what interests he's attempting to represent that the Tory party doesn't already represent. And I mean, the Greens, it's like almost the opposite of this, because it's like all of the people that I know who voted Green, and I know like a huge number of people that voted Green who have always voted Labour. They just did it because they wanted to vote a protest vote. They wanted to vote against Labour. They saw that Labour was going to win, and they just went, okay, like, because like in my constituency here, the Labour MP that won, who's been the Labour MP for a while, she lost like 12% of the vote share, even though she won. And most of that went to the Greens, right? So just in terms of material interest of these parties, it's really interesting to see what they represent. I mean, like it or not, Farage has shown that, like, even though they only got 4 or 5, 6 seats or whatever, he's going to be pretty powerful in UK politics going forward, in a really worrying way, because, like, as someone who has dealt many times with the UK immigration system, it's kind of fascist. You didn't hear that from me. It's allegedly kind of fascist already in the best of times. And, this is, I think, especially when we go on to here in a second to talking about France, this is one of the main worrying things. I mean, obviously, like, the rise of this right-wing populism, very worrying, for the obvious climate impacts of just, fucking drill all of the oil and natural gas out, burn everything. I mean, Labor got rid of its green pledge right on the campaign trail. But also in terms of immigration, because I mean, that's going to be a pretty worrying thing coming up here pretty soon with climate change. And of course, the far right, I should say, are the only people actually talking about it and treating it like a real issue. And of course, they're fascists. So, what are you going to do? It's not particularly great.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that it's yeah, and what's worrying is nobody's really articulating a counter argument to the one that says all of the current economic ills of the UK can be put down to immigration, or rather social services which are stretched because there are too many people making demands upon them, and the majority of those extra people are the people that we should stop making demands on. The social safety net of the UK are like asylum seekers who are apparently, according to sort of like the assumed common sense of the average reform voter, I say entirely anecdotally, the common sense understanding seems to be that not only are they taxing the system, but they're actually taxing the system disproportionately more than everybody else is. Like it's interesting to like get your accounts of interacting with the immigration system of this country, and then encounter the view put forward by a lot of people that like the system is set out actually to favor immigrants and asylum seekers, which
Yeah, it's
obviously it isn't, right? But that just speaks to like I mean, it's like whether there is something inherently more, not necessarily appealing, but like whether that kind of argument is more easily accepted by people, whether it appears to be a more appealing form of common sense to people, I don't know, or whether it's just that, like, I mean, you talk about Nigel Farage, right? Like, it's a fairly common centre-left complaint in this country, but like, he's been platformed and championed by the UK establishment for like 15 or plus years now, like, always in the media. Even the ostensible like non-biased like media that you get from the BBC, like still champion this person. Not to mention like the right-wing press, newspapers, and then you have the sort of like that media championing of this argument, combined with both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party's like flirting with this kind of narrative in various different ways. And that, I mean, the Labour Party's flirting with that narrative goes all the way back to the early Blair years, right? Like the Blair government said some of the most horrific things about asylum seekers and really created this narrative around the undeserving asylum seeker kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's so fucked to be like the asylum seeker stuff. Like, I mean, I would imagine most people listening to this show know this, but like, no legal way to seek asylum in the UK. The UK's immigration system has always been so far to the right and so crazy. This is literally one of the hardest, if not the hardest, countries on the planet to live in. Even for like me, who's done everything completely legally and come over here completely legally, it's like it's very difficult. And on all of my stuff, if you're an immigrant, there's big fucking letters on your BRP card that says you do not have access to public funds. You know what I mean? And yeah, I won't get into too much personal stuff, but it's also like you can't vote either. So it's like chill the fuck out. Like your country's fascist enough. Like it's okay. Before I say anything else that's going to get me into any more trouble with the UK Home Office, I love the Home Office, folks. We love the Home Office here. The last couple things to
Who is the new Home Secretary?
Who cares? Before we move on to the French election, couple things that I just wanted to mention. The personification of evil that is so unique to the British Isles. Jacob Rees-Mogg lost his seat, which is just like, that made me feel so good. Liz Truss lost her seat. God bless her little heart. And of course, Dan, our man, our guy, Corbyn won as an independent in a race that was forecasted to be close and just wasn't close at all. He just like blew the like dude that the Labour Party ran against him, who's just like a fucking profiteer off the NHS and privatization, all this stuff, just a complete schmuck, blew him out of the water. That made me feel so good.
Yeah, I mean, I find it difficult not. I found it very difficult not to gain a huge amount of joy from that result, kind of thing. Like,
yeah,
and yeah, I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about, like, is the small number of independents also won in this election, most of whom were primarily motivated or standing on a platform to sort of counter the Labour Party's pro-Zionist, anti-Palestinian position. So when we're talking about all the different ways in which the Labour vote is being squeezed in various ways, like they're now losing the sort of like South Asian Muslim population of the UK, or lost a huge number of those voters who historically have been very pro-Labour in their voting patterns as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the real movements that are affecting current world politics, at least in kind of like European and like the United States type countries, right? Like it is this kind of falling apart of the typical more or less two-party system on both sides of the aisle. And that does bring us really nicely into the French election, where I'm sure most people know this. Just to summarize again, the French system has 2 rounds of voting. The first round is to basically see who goes on to the actual round where they actually elect people. And after the first round, which was a week before the second round, before the final round, it looked like it's not a coalition, it's just a single party, isn't it? Le Pen and what's the other guy's name? Brassard or something?
I think there are some smaller parties in a coalition with the Front National, like some even like more fringe, more scary,
more insanely French fascist. It looked like they were just going to run away with it because they had gotten an absurd amount of votes. And in response to this, a bunch of the left-wing parties created a new Popular Front called the New Popular Front, where they basically coordinated dropouts in local elections to make it so that, no left-wing candidate would be running against another left-wing candidate, no communist against a socialist, no socialist against an ecologist or whatever that part of the Green Party is over there. And come a couple days ago, where the final election happens, complete reversal of fortunes. That worked perfectly. An excellent strategy, a fucking amazing strategy. You had Mélenchon in Stalingrad Square in Paris, leading everybody singing La Marseillaise. The new Popular Front or whatever, won the most votes, short of an outright majority, which as of when we're recording this, which is the Tuesday, the 9th, gonna throw the French system into a bit of a shit show because basically New Popular Front got the most votes, then it was the Weasley Macron centrist coalition, and then the fascist. I'm sorry, not the most votes, the most seats. And as of recording this, Macron has refused the resignation of the prime minister and said, no, you should just stay on. And meanwhile, Mélenchon is like, actually, I kind of feel like we should pick the prime minister. So it's a bit sketchy. There's a bit of a crisis going on. We'll see what winds up happening with that. One major takeaway from this, though, is kind of the reverse happened here, which is that, thank you, First Past the Post, the fascist party, Le Pen's party, got way more votes than everybody else. I believe in terms of total vote share, like 10% more than the New Popular Front, but lost huge on number of seats in a way that I'm sure won't lead to any sort of like fascist third column arguments or anything like that. Third column, whatever, however many columns it is. Anyways, really interesting in terms of strategy for the left to take on this rising right-wing fascist populism that we're seeing everywhere, and do it in a way, do it in just a way that really works, and in a way without more or less the help of the centrists, the liberals. It's just like hugely impressive. And I was shocked when this happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the parallels between the UK and France in some respects. I think France is like 5 years ahead of where the UK is going to be. There is some analysis that would say that Keir Starmer is generally a Macron type figure, but yeah, I mean, they've played the system very well. I mean, there are some obvious issues. I mean, you're right to raise the point that now, like, the whole political system's thrown into chaos. There isn't a majority in Parliament. The party of the president doesn't now control Parliament in any way. It's going to be quite difficult to work out how to form a government. They've sort of functionally played the election system, but they haven't actually overcome any of the underlying disagreements. I mean, my understanding is the left coalition, as you say, like the left coalition formed itself to stand as a party, sort of like outmaneuvering Macron in some ways. Like, I think Macron's assumption was like he was going to be, or his party was going to be, the party of opposition to the right. You have to vote for us or Le Pen's going to get in. Obviously, the left got it together enough to provide an alternative for that. I think what happens is, like, they have a first round of voting, and then anybody who doesn't win a majority in any of these constituencies, if somebody wins a majority, like over 50%, they get elected immediately. So there were some people elected in the first round. And then any seats where that didn't happen, there's like a runoff election kind of thing. There was like a sort of Popular Front alliance on the left, but then there was like also a sort of like Republican front that was created in the last week, where socialists or members of that sort of like left-wing alliance stood down in favor of members of Macron's party. I think they even stood down in favor of members of the old Conservative Party, like the Republicans. So I don't think it's entirely correct to say that there wasn't like a collaboration between the left and the center. And it's one of these unfortunate things, like French politics always calls upon people to come toward the center to prevent the right from coming to power. And I guess, I mean, in some respects, it's one of the reasons why some like communists would defend the first past the post system in the UK kind of thing. Like, at least if you win a majority, you've sort of like, you have control and you have the ability to implement your program. Like, I mean, it's hard to imagine a communist party winning a majority in the UK and being in a position to implement any kind of minimalist program. And I think personally, I'd be interested in seeing proportional representation introduced in this country and to see what that would do for creating new left parties. Anyway, I've wandered off course.
Well, it is what it is. Only other thing to say is that the Olympics are in like a few weeks, which is going to be the fucking shit show.
I mean, like the aesthetics of the French left. Like temporarily occupy the squares and wave your red flags and like spray
BBC was
graffiti
like
on things. And I mean we're capable of it in this country, but like compared to reactions to an election,
like, I mean, they left won and they still rioted. It's just like, hell yeah, let's go. Very, very crazy. And then I just have one more note, which is just 2 words, which is just meanwhile America's just off in the corner, kind of doing its own thing, attempting to cobble together a single candidate that can fucking form a single sentence. We'll see. I will say, all of a sudden, the Liberals are talking about electability again, which is so funny. It's like, electability. I remember that from when Bernie was running, and now look what's happening. Anyways, shame.
Right.
All right.
Well, that was look forward to.
You got that to look forward to. Dan, that was about over 20 minutes of us talking about current events. That's your allotment for the year, listeners. So good for you. I will. The only other takeaway I think is just, none of those. The French election isn't going to give us communism. It's not going to give us even socialism, as the author of today's reading would say. Everybody's more or less an opportunist. But you know what? You know what's better than having a fascist government is not having a fascist government. So you know what? I'm actually very impressed. I say well done. And the left actually strategized for once and it worked. So let's go.
I do feel the need to apologize to you for the fact that we don't grant you the opportunity to vote in this country.
Yeah, well.
Not because I want you to like have an opportunity to contrip to our democratic system.
Okay.
I really enjoy voting. There's something really like quaint about it. It's just ludicrous. Like they've introduced a voter ID system in this country. This is the first election where that's happened, which kind of like took something away from my enjoyment of the whole thing. But it's there's still some like retiree sort of fuddy-duddies manning a polling station where there's basically nobody there, and they still just like cross your name off a sheet with a pencil and give you your ballot. Like, I don't know. It's very quaint.
In America.
I love a little bit of quaintness.
It is very quaint because like here you go to like 1,000-year-old stone church and it's like, as you say, like septuagenarians making sure you vote. In America, it's like you go to the military local barracks and there's everything's very patriotic. Yeah, exactly. And you get your little American flag sticker. It's just like, I voted.
Yeah. If they ever like digitize the process of voting in this country, even if it's in person in a polling station, it'll be a sad day for me.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, what are you going to do? Such is life. We should probably.
I do like an election.
You love a good election. You love a good election. So you know what, Dan? It's because you're an opportunist. That's why. You're goddamn opportunist at heart.
Yeah. This week has made me wonder, like, in a hypothetical future scenario, we do have a left wing, like a communist party. What wing of that communist party would I sit on? I mean,
you have to decide.
I have opportunist tendencies,
Well, the opportunist tendency. Just call it what it is. I would like a career, please.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
All right. Well, old heads, auxiliary statements, old heads will know that we used to make a joke going on every week when we recorded that this week we were reading State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin because we just thought it was funny. We just thought it was a funny thing to say. Like that and the mass strike are like the two things. When you click the drop down menu on any communist website, read this first. It's like those two things. It's like, yeah, okay, I'll get right on that. Um, we decided to actually do it partially because we're still avoiding reading the last section of the value theory book by Isaac Rubin, but also because you know what? It actually seemed like it was going to be interesting. And I hate to say it, Dan, I really enjoyed reading this. You heard it here first. Lenin is an incredible writer. The guy knows how to write persuasively and entertainingly, but also really, I'm not going to say scientifically, but like really analytically. He knew what he was talking about, at least in this phase. His criticisms are of the two tendencies that he's mainly engaging with here. Opportunists and anarchists are as apt today as they ever have been. There's some stuff, of course, that I disagree with, but I think that's more an opportunity to kind of build on things that we know now than criticism, I guess. But yeah, I had a blast reading this. And I think it's partially because, like, whenever we read things from this era, where it's like whether we read some old councilist stuff that's criticizing Lenin or Rosa Luxemburg or any of those people, it's just like, back in the good old days.
It was really happening, they were really living it.
They're living, I mean, literally at one point, so this ends, the State and Revolution ends with a classic, this manuscript, cuts off here before it was finished, and Lenin writes a little postscript like a year or so later, and he's like, I wanted to finish this section, but I found it much more enjoyable to actually live the revolution and write about it. And I was like, God damn it, you son of a bitch, you lucky son of a bitch. But yes, that is to say, deeply enjoyed this, had a lot of fun, looking forward to talking about it. And I'm interested to know kind of what you thought now that we're reading this late in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I've never read this in full before. I have attempted to start it. I've not read a huge amount of Lenin. I sort of imagine this is the virtuous Lenin. This is the fun Lenin. Obviously, he's in full well, it's the classic mix of rhetoric and propaganda, and then sort of scathing polemic. You have to skim over quite a lot of who's this Menshevik that he's having a rant about now, and sort of the classic content that you always get from reading 100-year-old Marxist texts. But also this is the Lenin that everybody can agree with pretty much. It's this is the anarchists Lenin. I mean, I know he's criticizing anarchists throughout this, but even Noam Chomsky could enjoy the content of this book, being as he is a vociferous critic of sort of Leninism. So yeah, this is the
yeah.
I don't know whether there's a bad Lenin, but this is definitely the good Lenin.
my version of bad Lenin is when you try to read What Is to Be Done. I'm not saying that that's a bad text or whatever, but what I am saying is that there hasn't been a newspaper called Revoci Dea for 100 years. You know what I mean? And most of that is him polemicizing with it, but it's an opportunist.
That's just because he gave that book a really good title, and
exactly
people don't realize that actually
what is to be done.
Yeah.
Step 1, read What Is to Be Done. Yeah. Do that. Step 2. So okay, so we'll get into talking about it. So yeah, like I said, most of this book is, or this pamphlet novella is Lenin criticizing, on one hand, opportunists, which is to say kind of more what we think of as social democrats, lowercase s socialists, the people who voted for war credits, right? On one hand, and on the other hand, anarchists, right? And he basically says this whole thing is very much what's on the tin. It's Lenin grappling with what you're supposed to do, what the relationship between the revolution, because Lenin is obviously a revolutionary Marxist. He believes very much in a revolution, and a violent revolution, as he says many times, a forceful revolution. What's the relationship between that and the state? Does the working class take control of the state? Does it not take control of the state? Does it just vote itself in? Should there be violence? All of those questions. And basically, he portrays the anarchists as kind of foregoing the question and kind of just saying they don't answer do we need to smash the state? And if we do smash the state, what do we replace it with? And then the opportunists just ignore the question entirely. They say that this isn't even a question. They're not revolutionary. They just kind of say, I like my job as a bureaucrat or a party boss or whatever. The state is cool. It's been good to me. That's not a question. And so it's him going back and forth many times between maybe like a straw man version of anarchists, probably not at this time, and some very much real concrete opportunists, Kautsky and all of these types, right, and criticizing them. And again, he does it in a way that is eminently applicable today, as strange as it might seem to be talking about smashing the state with a working class movement. And yeah, I guess that is the reason that every sect ever tells you to read this, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess one of the things that makes the context of his writing this quite important is he is actually witnessing like revolutionaries from like the Menshevik faction of the Russian Social Democrats or the socialist revolutionaries in Russia actually taking up government positions in the new sort of like post February 1917 revolution, like taking up ministries in the government, and sort of like falling into the trap that he's accusing sort of like the opportunist wing of European Marxism of doing, of like falling for the trappings of officialdom. Now that extends a bit further because like it's a I guess like a polemical critique of the actions of certain socialists, and some of the theoreticians that have like worked to like justify that in some ways. I mean, I presume he doesn't give the like the most charitable account of either like Kautsky's considerations on the history or the status of the state vis-a-vis Marxist theory, or like he probably doesn't give the most charitable account of Bernsteinist reformism, and so like to get a proper account of what those people are saying, I'm sure it's probably more advisable to go to those first-hand texts, I guess. But also, like from a theoretical standpoint, he and one of the things that we, I think, can probably quite gladly get on board with when we're talking about his like theorizing the state, is one of the central hallmarks of the state that he characterizes after reading Marx is to say the state is, well, he seems to come down to like two fundamental characteristics of what a bourgeois state is, right? Like it's the sort of organized body of armed men, it's the army and the prisons and the ability to control and repress people, and then also it's the sort of like bureaucratic apparatus that's built up for running all of the state functions that sort of like protect bourgeois law and as an extension of that, like protect private property and uphold the judiciary, uphold the clergy, and one of the things that we would celebrate, I think, from things that we've read in the past, is that portion of Marxist theory that says we need to get rid of those specialities and trust that any and all members of the proletariat can take charge of running portions of their lives and the like broader economic web of relations that make up modern political and economic systems, kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the famous interaction between Marx and Bakunin, where Bakunin's like, haha, you fool, you think that everyone's going to be a member of the state? Marx is like, yeah, everybody's actually going to be a member. That is actually how things are going to work, in fact. And this is, when I say the criticism of opportunists is so ripe today, because it's like when the workers' movement is at such a low ebb, and it has been for so long, every socialist is going to be like, Pokemon go to the polls. You gotta vote out the Macrons of the world, which we just spent the full first half of the show talking about how good that was, and good for them. But that is just basically where people's horizons for a workers' movement begin and end, is in electoralism, right? And it's so refreshing reading something that's like, no, violent revolution, it must happen, and here's theoretically why. Go ahead.
But it is like so much of people's voting for Keir Starmer. And like, it's not, in some ways, like it can be characterized as opportunism from the position of the bureaucrats being elected, but there's like one of the ways in which, I mean, this is talked about in this book more broadly as a general criticism of democracy. And as I was reading this and reflecting on the election, the thing that was most poignant to me was that, like, and one of the things that was stuck in my head whilst the election was going on, and always goes on when there are elections, is like, why are people actually voting in the way that they do? How much engagement do they have with the system? And one of the criticisms you can make of bourgeois democracy is it like invites you to elect a cadre of people to administer the state, both economic and political, on your behalf. And most people's voting for Keir Starmer is just like hoping desperately that he'll be able to do something, hoping desperately that he'll have some kind of bureaucratic fix, or hoping desperately that they understand well enough like the workings of the economy to fix the system. Obviously, we would say
absolutely.
that there's terminal crises that they don't have the first basic understanding of. Not that
Or
I would say
interest
that
in
we
fixing,
do, or interest
like,
in understanding and fixing.
yeah. It's funny because I mean, right now the feeling in my union is very much like the Labor government's gonna fix everything.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I was speaking to someone that knows their stuff about immigration, and they had such the opposite take. They're just like, oh no, it's not going to get any easier. In fact, it's going to continue to get harder to live here. So good thing that you're doing it now. And I was just like, great. And it's interesting because Lenin, he touches briefly on this point, really briefly. There's only like a paragraph about this or something. But this also gets into the idea too, that it's like when these so-called socialists are elected into parliament, right? Whether they're Mensheviks or opportunists or whatever, right? Like they wind up becoming part of this bureaucracy that makes the working class not trust them. And it, for Lenin, this is a good thing because he's like, they're being pushed towards me, the correct one, the Bolsheviks, right? For their revolutionary takeover of the state. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think it just leads to a general disillusionment, at least in our time. Especially when there's no like open real socialists in the United States, at least I'm thinking, or, they've been run out of the Labor Party here. And I mean, this gets into Lenin's whole point about the fact that the opportunists will always say that what is the state? This gets into his question of what the state actually is and a theory about how it relates to class, right? And the opportunists and most people in general will say that if the state relates to class at all, then it is the organ that is basically put into place to reconcile the interests of contending classes, right? Many socialists think this. Most people think this, right? If they have a conception of class, that's what they think. But what Lenin's saying here is that it's very much the opposite. He's saying that it's a manifestation of what he calls the irreconcilability of classes, right? So it's the fact that there is this recognition that the working class's interest and the ruling class's interest are diametrically opposed, right? And that they will never be the same because one depends on the exploitation of the other. That's why you need a state. And in fact, that is what the state is. Now, he doesn't get into too much to talk about autonomy or in times of like, downtimes or local elections or different things like this, where, the state can act, at least in certain points, in the working class's favor. He's saying that in aggregate, this is exactly what it is. It exists to paper over, that contradiction that I just spoke about, but then also the contradiction of all of the different holes that capital accumulation digs itself, right? Where it's like quantitative easing is nothing more than just digging different capitalists, the ruling class, out of the holes that they've dug because of, failing accumulation cycles. So it exists basically to paper over these things. And so he says, once you recognize that, what are you going to do? Be an opportunist? You're going to go to the state and tell it to do socialism? Of course not. This is Lenin's whole point. Lenin says over and over in here, you can't just take control of the state. This is what Marx says, of course. You need to basically win the political battle on whatever front your tendency thinks you should do that. And then you actually smash this bureaucracy, you smash this standing army, and we can get on to what he thinks you should replace it with. But this is his general idea. Of course, Lenin, unsurprisingly, a revolutionary Marxist, right?
Yeah. And it's there's two things I feel like it's quite interesting. It'd be good to touch on. One is like not contained in this book necessarily, but like there is a degree of evolution in Lenin's thinking on this. Like the usual characterization of Lenin's theoretical progression is that Up until about 1914, he sort of like, and this is the like sort of general like Lars Lee thesis, right? Like he's actually quite an orthodox Marxist in the vein of Kautsky and the model presented by the German Social Democrats. And obviously he encounters the betrayals of the collapse of the collapse of the Second International at the beginning of the First World War, and encounters that sort of betrayal by the International in voting to support the war. And sort of goes on this journey, I guess, and because of his particular position in Russia, he sort of gets to sort of stand outside of those debates in some ways, I think. So sort of circumstances in some ways favor him, takes up this position of revolutionary defeatism, leading to civil war, being his sort of conception of how a revolution will come about. But I think actually it's encounters with the left wing of the Bolsheviks. It's actually through encounters with Nikolai Bukharin and other left wing Bolsheviks and other left wing Marxists in Europe. He sort of falls into this grouping, sort of the Zimmerwald anti war left. So I think there's a degree to which he's like, this is a new synthesis of ideas for him, and he's sort of like encountering bits of Marxism that he hasn't encountered before, by virtue of the fact that the orthodox Marxists generally overlook them. So much of this text is him quoting first-hand accounts from Marx and Engels, repeatedly saying things about the state, the function of the state, what's to be done with the state if the working class ever were to get into the position of taking control of it. There are things that Marx and Engels say which don't feature in the common understanding of orthodox Marxism at the time, that he's now encountering for the first time and beginning to champion. I think that like there is a conflict which we're sort of describing as opportunism, but maybe like I'd be inclined to try and consider it more favorably as the distinction between reform and revolution, and the conception that had taken hold in mainstream Marxism that well, maybe actually no, through democratic means, through building a social majority, they can rise to power and then use the state to do socialism. And a lot of the crux of this, what's being argued in this book, is like, how can socialists use the state? What's the appropriate approach to do if socialists did find themselves in the position of controlling the reins of state power, I guess.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think, to go back to something you said a little earlier on, I think the depths of opportunism, the depravity that they'll sink to, because I think that you're saying that a lot of the times they weren't engaging with things that Marx and Engels said, and you're right. But there's one example in here that sticks out to me where Lenin says, and again, this might be uncharitable to Bernstein, I don't think anybody's going to care too much about that, but at one point, Bernstein takes the quote of Marx where Marx says something along the lines of, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the state machinery, because then you would just become the appropriating, like, this is a tool for their own oppression, so they can't just take hold of the working class, the machinery. And Lenin says that obviously means that, you can't take hold of this machinery that's designed to exploit you. But then he portrays Bernstein as interpreting that quote as meaning, well, the working class cannot simply just have a revolution. They cannot simply just, take all of the power away from everybody, all of the other interests in the world, in class society. And it's just like, damn, if that is what Bernstein meant, he's a fucking idiot, or he is just straight up an opportunist. And I think, to speak to this question of, is this opportunism or is this reform versus revolution? I think Lenin is probably right at this point to call it opportunism, because he has seen the development of the so-called reform wing of socialist politics and where that leads, right? Because, like, you can call yourself a reformist all you want. You can talk about the slow road to socialism. You can talk about the end meaning nothing, the journey being everything, right? But at a certain point, you have to contend with, wait a minute, why did all of these people that were talking about reform just vote for an imperialist war? You know what I mean? It kind of seems like what that leads to, in a like bureaucratic systems theory sense, is these people just getting really comfortable with where they're at and just kind of being opportunists. They're like, hey, I'm the head of a massive fucking party. I got all this power. I got a nice paycheck. Maybe Marx didn't actually want revolution. You know what I mean? Yeah, I'm kind of more inclined to think that. But yeah, I do see what you're saying.
I mean, it speaks to something we talked about with Viv last week, right? Like, there is an extent to which you could at least be like neutral toward Bernstein and say, well, he was proposing a scientific theory that was worth testing, was worth considering. It's like a justified proposal in like 1902 or whatever. But in 1917, history had taken a course, and it just like that theory had not stood up to the tests of reality, I guess.
Yeah, and it's just a different project. It's like you can't really even really call it Marxism at that point. Which, hey, as Viv said last time, fair enough. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I don't know. I don't want to give this like omnipotent agency to this totality that we call the working class, but it's like nobody had any idea back then that wasn't going to work. If you were in Germany at the height of the social democratic movement and it all became legal, you'd probably be like, oh, this seems like something worthwhile trying. Why not? And then it turns out everybody's been working with the Kaiser and like they vote for war credits. And you're like, well, luckily the working class of the future will never follow this strategy again. And everybody will learn from their mistakes. Anyways. Okay. So speaking of learning from maybe not mistakes, maybe from successes, partial successes, we can then talk a little bit about the commune. I love it whenever we get a good discussion of what Marx was talking about when he was like, at last, when he's talking about the Paris Commune, the political form that the working class's revolution will take to undertake its own economic emancipation has been discovered. I love it whenever people really try and figure out what Marx was talking about there, because it's such an exciting and tantalizing, like, series of lines from Marx. I mean, what we got to recognize about Marx is that Marx was really, really didn't want to come across as a utopian. Justified or not, he just didn't want to. He didn't want to be seen as making predictions that weren't going to come true. And I think more importantly, and I think this is something a lot of us can learn from, he didn't really want to impose on the working class of the future a way that things should be done, right? So we always hear that this is why he didn't talk about socialism. Of course, he did talk about what it was going to look like, blah, 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 blah. But Lenin here is explaining why the Paris Commune is so important. And he's basically just cribbing all of this from Marx. But he explains it here in a really clear way, right? So he says that the commune represented the kind of immediately possible measures that a working class political movement can take, or a working class revolutionary movement can take, as soon as it takes political power. Right? What can it do to ensure that taking power won't just amount to taking control of the bourgeois state and running a bourgeois state? What can it actually do to ensure that it's going to be a self-perpetuating movement that eventually realizes the economic emancipation of the working class and creates a classless society and all this stuff? And the immediately possible measures are just two really simple things. I mean, we can talk about how realistic it is to think that this is just the two things you need to do. I'm not going to say that that's all Lenin's saying you need to do, but it's basically these things that we've probably spoken about before on the show, which is one, the immediate, and it gets to what you were saying about the two things that make a bourgeois state. The commune immediately eradicated the army and replaced it with an armed militia, right? It armed the working class, got rid of the standing army. And the second thing is universal suffrage and paying everybody who is involved in this commune, involved in the organization of this state, air quotes, a workman's wage, right? Which is to just say you're not paying them any more than the average worker. This gets rid of opportunism. It gets rid of all sorts of different things. And in addition to universal suffrage, you have to make everybody immediately recallable. Yeah, I just love that. It's so interesting, and it's so funny because it's like Marx talks about these two things. I suppose it's like a few more. It's like a series of things, but he talks about them, and then he just speaks about them so highly as like, that's it. That's what you got to do. That's what the commune is. Universal suffrage, everybody's recallable, arm the people. You're on your way to, a classless society.
And it's funny. It can feel like naivety, right? Because like it's such a fleeting glimpse of a possibility. Like the commune lasts how many months, right? Not very long at all. And most of the energy that goes into it for Marx afterwards is like analyzing the defeat and trying to work out what happened, what went wrong. And so, yeah, as I say, it can look like naivety, except for when you take into account, I guess, what you were saying of like Marx's desire not to appear as a utopian. Like he doesn't want to fall into the trap of just saying exactly how a socialist system should look, and in the form of the events of the Paris Commune in 1871, what's being vindicated for Marx or in Marxism is through the process of revolutionary struggle, things emerge, opportunities emerge, but also like systems emerge and ways of organizing and ways of constructing a society. And I mean, what surprised me about this book actually there wasn't particularly many, if any, references to the sort of like the Soviet form, the Workers' Council form. But like, I feel like a lot of people encountered that in the early 20th century in a very similar way as like, here's this thing that we couldn't predict, nobody designed, but it's sort of emergent from struggle kind of thing. What was fun about this book, I mean, I'm just going to, if anybody wants to correct me, please do. I'm just going to assume that this is a reasonably good account of the key touchstone reference points in the sort of corpus of Marx and Lenin, when it comes to explaining and elucidating their developing theories around the state and the state's relationship to a potential communist revolution and how the working class should relate to that. And in that context, the first several chapters of this book are really quite thrilling. And also what they do is elucidate what we talked about last week about the sort of, and we've talked about before, about the sort of like scientific method of Marx and Lenin, right? And no, Marx and Engels rather, and how their theories developed. So like you have the Marx and Engels writing the Communist Manifesto immediately prior to the revolutions of 1848, and describing a certain relationship to the state, which is actually very much in line with the kind of like reformist model of it. They talk about like taking over the state and using it to the working class's ends. And the portion of the Communist Manifesto that Engels quotes, they sort of talk about using the capitalist system, the working class developing the productive forces to make possible the conditions for communism. And you can look to that text and be like, okay, Marx and Engels have this like reformist approach, one particular relationship to the state, and then they actually encounter the events of 1848, and the way Lenin describes it, Marx and Engels come away with just more data on understanding the historical evolution of the state and how that overlaps with both the development of the productive forces of capitalism and the social relations of capitalism that underlie that, right? They talk about the first French Revolution as being like, as like consolidating the French state into a sort of like unitary form. They recognize in 1848 the emergence of like the army and the bureaucracy, these reactions from the capitalist system to the conflict that's emerging with the working class. And then as they go into speaking about the Paris Commune, before that, but also in the immediate aftermath of that, they feel obliged to go back and correct these things that they've said in the Communist Manifesto and say, well, actually, no, it, as has been emergent, the evidence of history has shown that the job of the working class is actually to smash the state and not just take it over and use it for its own ends, but rather to radically transform it for the working class's ends, I suppose.
Mm. Yeah, and again, yeah, radically. That's kind of the key bit. Radically transform it, because whether you want to think about it in terms of systems theory or what, like the most radical workers movement on the planet could take control of the like UK's bureaucracy, and if it didn't change anything, it would just immediately be like a reactionary force, right?
Sorry, Lenin talks about like in reference to like Engels, I guess it's the difference between like quality and quantity, right?
Yeah.
Like he specifically uses those pieces of terminology as we talked about last week, that one of the hallmarks of the dialectical method that Engels applies to history is this the transformation of like a qualitative increase becomes a quantitative change. And it's something that we've talked about loads of times every time we talk about history, right? It's this distinction between continuity and change, right? When does a continuity become a change, and how do you recognize it at the time, and is it only recognized afterwards? And that's very much at the heart of what Lenin's talking about here. Is like we can reference back now to like this distinction between his polemic against the sort of reformist opportunists and his polemic against the anarchists, right? And he's putting himself in the middle of that. Like, we've got to do something radical with the state, we've got to smash it, but we can't do away with it immediately.
Yeah, well, this is the main bit that he's talking about. The quality and quantity stuff relates directly to Marx's ideas on the Paris Commune, right? Because it's the idea of extending democracy, right? The bourgeois promise of democracy to such a point that it qualitatively changes into something else, right? Eventually, according to Lenin, this is the idea of universal suffrage and immediately recallability, right? It's like, okay, well, do more democracy to the point where it just completely changes into something else. And I mean, later on in this, right towards the end, there's a great summary of a series of polemics between Pannekoek and Kautsky. And Lenin is here just like unequivocally defending Pannekoek, which is so cool. It's like, call that Marxist unity. We love that. That's so great. But basically what Pannekoek is saying is that the workers' struggle for political power for state control, quote unquote, is simultaneously a struggle for political power and a struggle against the state. So it's a struggle for the state and a struggle against the state. Kautsky reads this and it just breaks his brain, and he's like, you silly left communist. How could this possibly, how could two things that are in disagreement, there's obviously a better word for that.
The rare case of somebody being too dialectical.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, not insufficiently. You are too dialectical, my young friend. And it's interesting because basically, this is like peak Kautsky at his absolute, like, kind of weakest, like, moronic peak, because he basically criticizes Pannekoek for saying that the working class needs to do away with the bureaucracy, right? And Kautsky says, no, we need the bureaucracy. That's our bureaucracy that you're talking about. It serves the people, right? And this gets into the ideas of like irreconcilability versus reconcilability, obviously. But Lenin makes a point when he's defending Pannekoek, where he's just like, we only need the bureaucracy right now because we're in capitalism. As soon as we don't have capital social relations, we don't need the bureaucracy anymore. And it's just classic. I love that. And it comes right at the end of this book too. And it's just like, the little cherry on top. It's so good. All right. Well, there's a few more bits in here. We can maybe get into some of the stuff that we might have criticisms of, or again, at least things that we've learned from and can build upon what Lenin is saying here. A lot of the main, like, kind of left critiques of state and revolution, come from the way that he treats the critique of the Gotha program in this, and especially the way that he probably misreads the critique of the Gotha program in a couple of ways. The main way being he's attempting to say, look, Marx said that there's going to be socialism first, and then we're going to get communism. But if you read the critique of the Gotha program, that kind of isn't what Marx is saying at all. Marx's main point in the critique of the Gotha program, and we spoke about this on the show before, is that he, in the sections that Lenin is referencing here, Marx was grappling with the phrase "from each according to their ability to each according to their own," which we can think of as, and Marx did, as high stage communism. This is the most developed stage of communism, versus the lower stage of communism, where Marx believes that there is still an element of bourgeois right in socialist or in communist society. For Lenin, this basically becomes something else. Marx is kind of seemingly semi-reluctantly talking about from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. It seems like he's only put it in there to kind of say how much actually needs to change before we can get there. Marx, of course, is also really specifically focusing on the social relations that need to change in order to get to either of these stages, whereas Lenin in The State and Revolution kind of isn't focusing on social relations really at all. There isn't a lot of discussion on communal property relations and the abolition of private property as being the key thing that actually determines a communist society or not. When he talks about labor vouchers here, Lenin basically says that you need to have the state to administer these labor vouchers. And I think this gets into kind of a misreading again of what Marx meant in that passage where he's talking about bourgeois right. All Marx is talking about when he talks about how bourgeois right still exists under lower stage communism is basically only because we don't have work as much as you want, take as much as you want, from each according to their ability, teach according to their own. And the reason for that is when you institute a labor voucher system, some people are still going to be able to work more. And so they're going to be able to consume more. And for Marx, that's just completely unavoidable. But Lenin here kind of takes this to kind of some strange political conclusions where he basically says, he doesn't basically say, he comes out and says this, and what I hope is a really tongue-in-cheek way, but I don't think it is. He comes out and says, well, because there's still bourgeois right in this lower stage communist society, he calls it socialist, then there's going to basically be the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie, which is his way of saying, because the state is this thing that, papers over the contradictions of any given society. Oh, look, Marx said that there's going to be a contradiction in lower stage communist society. Therefore, we need something that's going to like forcibly hold these contradictions together. And that was kind of used to justify some of the worst atrocities of Stalinist practice in the later years of the Soviet Union. It's not particularly like a great way of thinking about, the political determination of lower stage communism. And I think is maybe one of his biggest errors.
I found this really troubling when I got to this. And there was there's a clear line here from, here the kind of the good Lenin, as I was trying to describe it before, the Lenin that's so close to being right. And then there's a very clear trajectory from this to like the authoritarian nature of the Soviet Union and all of the critiques that are made of Lenin and the Soviet Union by Jan Appel and the Group of International Communists in the Fundamental Principles book, right? Like, and actually, I feel like the line of thought for that runs all the way through this book. And one of the things we haven't really talked about yet, and it's probably good to talk about it now, is that the primary justification for potentially still needing a state, and the primary reason why you should arm the working class is so that they're in a position to like enforce their will. Obviously, they're characterizing the state as being a class apparatus, and all throughout history, all the different forms of state that have been attendant to all the different historical modes of production have been designed to benefit a minority in its effort to exploit a majority. And Lenin, and I think Marx and Engels probably fairly talk about taking over the state, but like using it in its reverse function, like instituting the dictatorship of the proletariat, and therefore being in a position for, whilst you still live in the sort of dying remnants of a class society, but you have a new political situation where the proletariat are now in charge of that process, the state, and also it's like force of it's the wing of the state which can deploy force, is touted as being necessary for the repression of the bourgeoisie. Now, we could debate like how icky or virtuous that feels. We could debate what that means in some respects. We could debate what that means in the context of like 1871 versus 2024. But that sort of like that willingness to deploy force, and not something that's not. I don't necessarily agree with that assessment of the situation. I don't mind the term dictatorship of the proletariat, and I don't mind a conception of a working class party or whatever coming to power and having to implement a program which is designed to inhibit the functioning of capitalism. Obviously, there is always this like troubling distinction between inhibiting capitalism and inhibiting the capitalists,
or the enemies of the working class.
Yeah, whoever they may be, and we read that essay by Moshe Stone, right, which talks about the sort of worst incarnations of that misunderstanding. That idea, combined with Lenin's reading of the critique of the Gotha program, which is saying, okay, we're still going to have to protect some kind of like bourgeois rights, or like bourgeois conception of right, a certain degree of fairness, which fairness in relationship between what you consume of society's production versus what you put in, sort of like potentially glossing over an underlying unfairness, and that sort of fairness unfairness discussion being something that is still pertinent to society. I mean, I think in a developed communist society for Marx, it's not necessarily that we'll overcome that, but it won't be important. And I think for Lenin too, that's the trajectory that he's imagining. But when it almost feels like, I don't know whether this is a fair reading or not, but it almost feels like when you're saying that there's going to be sort of like those remnants of bourgeois societal norms without a bourgeoisie, but then there is a state apparatus designed to sort of repress the bourgeoisie, and there's some hypothetical human being in the future that's going to emerge and be appropriate, sort of like appropriately socialized to high stage communism. You do sort of set the conditions for a communist state forcibly conditioning the working class to ends that are determined by a state bureaucracy, I feel like. And then just generally on the sort of mechanics of it, like he talks about the working class being one factory, one productive body, which in some ways I agree with, right? Like our aim is to unite producers as producers. But also there's an argument to be made where the system that we might want to put in place that would do that would actually defend the autonomy of producers in their workplaces, right? Like that's where the Fundamental Principles book starts in its critique of Soviet communism, is that it doesn't give the workers the right of disposal over what they produce. Anyway, long ramble over. Yeah, I do feel like there's like there is a line to the worst excesses of Stalinism from what Lenin is saying here. That was my first reaction anyway.
And I do think it's just a theoretical misunderstanding. I think that he's just kind of misunderstanding what Marx was saying in the critique of the Gotha program. I think he's putting way too much weight on this idea of like the single issue of bourgeois right, which is literally just like, hey, you work more, you get more. You don't need a state. I'm sorry, you really like don't need a state in the sense that Lenin is talking about here to oversee a labor voucher system a la Group of International Communists. You really just don't. Mm-hmm. And it's this kind of political determinism that Lenin is working with here. Like what I would have liked in the text that you're supposed to read that talks all about, the relationship of the state and politics to the revolution. What I would have liked is like most of it to be a discussion of the social relations that bring about communism and not about the relationship of the workers' movement to the state, because it's not touched on at all here. Like it really isn't. And, the state, culture, all of these different things. This is like Marxism 101. Like these are outgrowths they're like epiphenomena of the base, which is the economic, like social relations of a given society. That kind of should be given. And the whole point of like the councilists that came after Lenin and that were easily able to critique him for making this mistake is that, no, you need to figure out a way. And I'm not sure that anyone has found this way, especially not the councilists, but you need to figure out a way to institute those social relations with as little force as possible and with as little intimidation as possible. Obviously, every Marxist is going to recognize the necessity of a revolution. Everyone's going to recognize that there is going to be some intimidation that's necessary to make these things happen. But you simply just don't need this state that's poking people to like hold a communist society, or as Lenin would say, a socialist society together. And if you do, it's just really not working towards high stage communism at all. Because like to Lenin, because he's kind of working with a theory of economics of communism that is kind of heavily borrowed from Hilferding and the general cartel stuff, you don't really have that built-in framework of the social relations of communism that Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha program lead you easily from one point to another. This is why you can just smash the state and replace it with the Paris Commune, because once you set up a system where you're able to have, communal property relations, production for use, directly social labor, not alienated labor, once you're able to do that, you eventually, probably, if society decides to do it, they might not, you eventually do just get to high stage communism. You don't need, the Politburo or Gosplan poking you in the right direction. And if you are doing that, you're probably not, going about things in the right way. So it is just political determinism, I think. Yeah, it's a bit of a bummer.
Yeah. And he's like, it's funny how he introduces this terminology of communism versus socialism, touts it as a common sense, also acknowledges that Marx doesn't use those terms and actually just talks about higher and lower stage communism, acknowledges that Marx would say that they're one and the same thing when it comes to mode of production, I suppose. Sort of acknowledges that what Marx is actually talking about is a growth, a sort of like it's the dialectics of history taking over and governing the evolution of socialism or communism from the point of revolution and the initial transformation in social relations, the institution of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is communism.
Yeah, that is communism. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Those are the social relations of communism. Lenin, yeah. But that's the thing. It's like a lot of...
We sound like left communists.
Well, yeah, I know. Exactly. Well, that's the thing. Every sect has one, kernel of truth that attracts people to it, and then they just go off on tangents. This is the kernel of truth and like all like left communist thought. It's just that focus on the social relations. How do we get there? Oh, right. Right. Yeah, I don't know. That's the thing. Most Marxists, socialists, whatever, want to kind of like, they're unable to recognize that communism continues to develop once you have those social relations, just like all other modes of production. It's fine. Like the communism of immediately after the revolution isn't going to be high stage communism, just like capitalism of whatever century you think it started isn't the capitalism of today,
Because that's communist utopianism, right? Like,
well, yeah, that's communization.
Communism is the utopia, and like, and not just like history,
Yeah, I also
maybe communism won't last forever. You just don't know what's the evolution. If we ever get there,
we'll get replicators, and then we'll all just be able to have the Wall-E, things where we ride around,
all one entity in the machine.
Exactly. Whatever thing gets us to a solution of the Fermi paradox, that's I think the correct answer.
Just projections on the outer sphere of the universe.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so the last thing I want to talk about with you, Dan, is how much stock we put in this idea, this definition of the state that is being put forward here of what a state is, because I'm not actually certain I really agree with like Lenin or really like Engels, I think, on what their conception of a state is. I could be wrong about this. I'm more than happy to be told that I'm wrong about this. But this idea that a state is only a state in the proper sense when it is, this mechanism that is used by the ruling class of a class society to like, intimidate and coerce the exploited class and to paper over the contradictions. And once we get to communism, that won't be a state. That won't be a state at all. I'm not sure that I buy that line of thinking, because like we've spoken about this on the show before. France just scored 8 minutes in. Look at that. Pretty good. I am also watching the football. I think if we're in communist society, let's just say we have our like councilist, like, perfect view of the group of international communists version of what communism is not like the Association of Planners and the cascading councils or the Democratic Republic or whatever. People might just call that a state because it is a method of like organizing society to the extent where it does things that the given, base social relations can't do on their own. And it's just a way, like people might just continue to call that a state.
What's the quote about the administration of things?
That accounting is going to be more important.
Well, no, like it's like well, it becomes an accounting process, like it becomes the same function, the same administrative function exists stripped of its class form, I guess,
Yeah.
And
Well, it's a content informed thing. That's what kind of what I'm thinking, because it's like, yeah, the form completely changes throughout human society as long as there's been like, I don't know. I suppose all I'm saying is that if you simply define a state or something like that, if you define it a bit more broadly than the typical Marxist conception of a state is only a thing when it, coerces the exploiting class or whatever. And if you just define it as something that like
yeah, I
helps
mean,
manage society, then
I mean, if it's a administrative structure that helps reproduce the social relations of a mode of production, then we'll have that under socialism, surely.
Exactly. I don't know. I just kind of think that like maybe the conception of a state as no, that's not going to exist under socialism, but we're going to have this thing that does a lot of the same things, right? It's just like, I don't know. It kind of leads you to a like this Leninist conception, or the conception of Lenin's, where he kind of has to tie himself in knots and be like, it's not going to be a state, but it's also actually kind of going to be a bourgeois state, but we're not going to have any of the bourgeoisie. It's like, I don't know, dude. You can call it a commune, call it what you want. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's the same. It's like we're gonna have the transfer of goods. We're not gonna have exchange, right?
Exactly.
We're gonna have labor tokens. We're not gonna have money. We're not gonna have value, but we are gonna have these are fundamentally different things, but also like in their immediate appearance, in the process of. I mean, I hope in their immediate appearance, at the point of transformation from capitalist to socialist social relations, I actually hope that we don't recognize.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if we don't, I mean, maybe that's a reformist entirely. That's me betraying my reformism, right? But but also there have been transformations in the mode of production whereby it's only really I mean, clearly tumult is happening, but like it's only recognized as a change in quality rather than a change in quantity after the fact. And if we manage to have a transformation to socialism where that happens, I mean, maybe that's just the like Bernsteinian delusion. I don't know, but but I mean, I hope that's possible. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it would be a whole lot easier for people if you continued to call your labor certificates like, I don't know, money or something. Because like even in the fundamental principles, they basically say like in a lot of ways, this is just as simple as replacing money with a unit of direct labor measurement. And it's just like, oh yeah, at that point, you might just be like, here's my communist dollar, here's my communist pound. I know that like sets off alarm bells for people because it's like, obviously it's
that's
not
like Karl Marx bobbleheads and
yeah, he's gonna be on the communist
Marx, Engels, Lenin t-shirts and stuff.
Yeah. You know what? I was in Liverpool this past weekend and went to the Museum of Slavery. My partner was like, do you want to go to the Beatles Museum or the Museum of Slavery? And I was like, I feel like I should go to the Museum of Slavery. I can't go to the Beatles Museum.
This sounds like my trip to Berlin recently. It was just like,
oh, God.
Sorry, no. Cool.
All I'm going to say, they had a whole thing there on Harriet Tubman.
Cool.
Fucking, I'm not one to have like heroes. She is like as legendary of a human being as ever has been. So, you know what? If we have people on money in communism, which hopefully we don't, also we won't have money. But if we do, Harriet Tubman, she's my vote.
She's on the dollar.
She's on the dollar, the communist dollar. That will do nothing to assuage like communizer fears that like labor vouchers are just money.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Well,
or right-wing phases, it's all just culture wars, and
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Once we get Harriet Tubman on the money, then it's fine.
Not my dollar.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there is plenty of other stuff in here. I mean, usually we end episodes with being like, you should read this. Obviously, you read State and Revolution, you probably already have. It's taken us a very long time to do it. And we need a new thing that we're going to joke about reading. This week we read Capital. We're getting there. But yeah, this is very good. Very, very good. I enjoyed talking about this. And once again, whenever we go back to this era, I'm just like, yes, the good stuff. And it was all possible. Like, he literally writing this as he was involved in a revolution.
Yeah. At the low point, hiding in Finland somewhere in a shack.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's 1905 all over again.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? Yeah.
What are you going to do? What is to be done?
What is to be done? Yeah, well, Indeed. We'll read that at some point in the future, I'm sure. What is to be done? Step 1, do that. All right, Dan. Well, I don't know what we're reading next time, but I feel like we can't put off finishing the value theory book anymore. So maybe we do just have to do that soon. Yeah, we'll see. We'll figure it out. All right. Well, should probably go watch some football, Dan.
Yeah, I might do that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much.
It's been nice. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks everyone for sitting through our current events analysis.
Suppose that there's anybody still there. Yeah. Sorry that went on so long. Maybe we should put a little timestamp on the beginning. Just like skip to
parental guidance necessary. All right. Cool. We'll see everybody later. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.